out of more than $21 million in more than 40 states. The scammers made phone calls pretending to be an individual's grandchild who needed money for bail, and after being arrested, or pretended to be the grandchild's attorney and were told that they could not speak to anyone about the arrest. This is one of the many heartbreaking examples of scams perpetrated on Americans by illegal robocallers and bad actors. According to recent estimates, in April of 2025, nearly 2,000 robocalls were placed to U.S. consumers every second. Spam and scam calls make consumers feel threatened, fearful, and distrustful of legitimate calls. As more and more Americans ignore calls from unknown numbers, they miss important calls. Moreover, fraud perpetrated against Americans by illegal robocalls costs an average of $25 billion annually, primarily affecting those who cannot afford such losses. We're also seeing a lot of unwanted and scam robotext and AI-generated phone calls and text messages, including voice clones and deep fakes. According to the FCC, consumer complaints about unwanted text messages increased 500-fold between 2015 and 2022. Americans are frustrated, and understandably so. In 2019, the bipartisan Pallone-Thune Telephone Robocall Abuse Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence, or Traceback, was enacted to help reduce the flood of illegal robocalls. The Trace Act allowed the FCC and law enforcement to impose stricter penalties for intentional violations of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA. Improved adoption of technical solutions like stir and shake and call authentication framework, and established a federal interagency working group to combat illegal robocalls. As a result, U.S. telecommunications carriers have made progress implementing stir, shaken into their networks. This framework authenticates that phone calls are coming from legitimate phone numbers, which helps reduce the number of spoofed and illegal robocalls. Generally, to operate within the U.S., voice service providers must now implement robocall mitigation programs and file these plans and their stir, shaken compliance certifications in the robocall mitigation database overseen by the FCC. Moreover, in July 2020, the FCC recognized the USTelecom Industry Traceback Group as the single registered consortium to conduct private-led traceback efforts that identified the source of an illegal robocall. The FCC has also taken measures to address the growing burden of unwanted and scam robotext and abused AI technologies. Specifically, in March 2023, the agency adopted regulations targeting scam robotext. In addition, industry actors have partnered with federal agencies to launch new programs such as robotext tracing. Lastly, in August, the FCC proposed rules to protect consumers from AI-generated robocalls and robotexts. These are steps in the right direction, and I applaud the coordination we've seen thus far. While the TCPA has provided many useful tools, the TCPA's private right of action has given rise to class action lawsuits focused on minor infractions rather than the bad actors responsible for placing illegal robocalls, and it has not reduced the number of illegal robocalls or improved consumer protection. In addition, stir-shaken implementation among smaller carriers has been delayed, and bad actors have exploited these providers' reliance on legacy infrastructure. Moreover, a majority of illegal robocalls and robotexts originate overseas, making them hard to trace. Because these bad actors are outside the jurisdiction of U.S. law enforcement, they are challenging to combat. Finally, the FCC must grapple with emerging technologies and navigate the best way to create appropriate guardrails for these technologies while simultaneously continuing to support innovation. We will always have robocalls and robotexts because not all of them are illegal. Many are used for legitimate purposes by U.S. businesses and public entities, but we must continue finding ways to combat the unwanted communications. I want to thank our panel of witnesses for joining us. I look forward to a robust discussion to understand the current landscape of illegal robocalls and robotext plaguing U.S. consumers and businesses so we can work together to identify and address remaining challenges. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Clark, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our panel of witnesses for appearing before us today. Americans are tired of hundreds of unwanted calls and texts they receive every year from scammers attempting to steal their hard-earned money. In 2023, Americans lost over $25 billion to phone-based scams. These criminals target the vulnerable and kind-hearted by pretending to be law enforcement, Medicare, or even relatives in order to scam them out of hard-earned money. Enough is enough. For years, there have been a bipartisan effort to address this issue. In 2019, Democrats and Republicans came together to pass the Pallone-Thune Traceback, giving the federal government greater enforcement ability and the authority to implement a call authentication framework and force phone carriers to improve the traceback of illegal calls. Under the Biden administration, the Federal Communications Commission created the Robocall response team that has assisted in cutting off providers who facilitate illegal robocalls. And last year, Ranking Member Pallone led a Democratic package to close the loopholes scammers rely on to target Americans. Committee Democrats are now working on updates to strengthen that package. Unfortunately, the Trump administration and congressional Republicans are retreating from the fight against illegal robocalls and robotexts. Just last week, President Trump released his 2026 budget proposal, in which he recommends cutting $42 million and firing 83 people from the Federal Trade Commission. By the Trump administration's own definition, the mission of the FTC is to protect the public from unfair or deceptive business practices, including unlawful telemarketing and robocalls. How can we expect the federal government to do more to protect Americans when the Trump administration is firing the very people whose job it is to enforce the law? Right now, law enforcement in all 50 states and the District of Columbia are combating robocalls. A bipartisan group of 40 state attorney generals wrote to Congress to say that their state laws regulating artificial intelligence help prevent spam phone calls and texts. But just a few weeks ago, Republicans on this committee voted for a reconciliation package that includes a 10-year moratorium on enforcement of state and local AI laws that these state attorney generals are opposed to. This provision stops states in their tracks from doing important work when we have not yet provided a federal solution. I think my Republican colleagues forget they are not the only elected officials in this country. State legislators, law enforcement work in tandem every day to stop these harassing robocalls and texts, and you should not stand in their way. Stopping robocalls and texts will require dedicated employees at every level of government. Congressional Republicans should not hamstring the efforts of state and local enforcement, and President Trump should not slash and burn the budgets and staff of federal agencies, all of which are dedicated to serving the American people. We in Congress have a duty to our constituents. Committee Democrats are here to prioritize the will of the people who put us in these chairs, not prove our loyalty to Donald Trump. If my Republican colleagues honestly want to stop illegal robocalls and robotexts, let's work together to support the federal employees and agencies that work instead of tearing them down. Having said that, I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer, and I thank the ranking member, Clark. I thank you for holding this hearing. A lot of times when we're back from our breaks away from home, people in D.C. ask us, what are you hearing back home? And I will tell you, I mean, of all the things going on in Washington, D.C., one of the number one things I hear is robocalls. And I was sitting with a good friend of mine who's a little older and just chatting with him for about an hour during the break, and I bet his phone rang 4 or 5 times, and each one was a robocall. So this is important. It's important to the American people. It's not just because of the annoyance. It's because of the people that get ripped off with these people, and there are over 52 billion robocalls, and that's 4 billion calls a month, an average of 13 calls per person. At the outset, I'd like to state that many robocalls are both legal and necessary. Robocalls are used to convey public service announcements and emergency messages. They're used for announcing school closures and providing reminders of upcoming appointments and payments. These are the calls that we want, but a large number of robocalls are illegal and are used to defraud, harass, and deceive customers. We've all received calls where someone on the other end of the line pretends to be IRS or Treasury and attempts to offer student loans or debt relief and sell insurance or claims to be a bank or a credit card company. According to one survey, American victims of fraud lost an average of $450 to phone scams that prey on trust and exploit vulnerabilities. This exploitation is despicable, and the impact on victims is tragic, and many have lost their entire life savings, and we know this must stop. And thankfully, in 2019, the committee passed the bipartisan, bicameral legislation which President Trump signed into law, the Pallone-Thune Trace Act, to combat the epidemic of illegal robocalls, and I was proud to vote for that. The Trace Act is an important law that provides the FCC and its partners with greater enforcement authority to hold illegal robocallers and bad actors accountable. Since the enactment of the Trace Act, the FCC has used its authority to issue additional rules as well as civil and criminal penalties under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. As a result, we've seen a downward trend in the prevalence of illegal robocalls. In addition, the FCC continues to mandate the voice service providers implement stir, shaken, caller ID authentication technology and provide robocall mitigation plans through the Robocall Mitigation Database. Furthermore, in 2020, USTelecom's Industry Traceback Group, or ITG, was recognized as the single private consortium to trace back the origins of suspected illegal robocalls, helping us to stop these calls at their source. Altogether, we've seen some great work done by our federal agencies and their industry partners. However, despite these strides forward, illegal and scam robocalls persist. We're even seeing a significant increase in unwanted scam and robotexts, which include messages alerting consumers to act on undeliverable packages and unpaid tolls, to name a few examples. Complicating these issues are new developments in artificial intelligence, including voice cloning and deepfake technologies to impersonate individuals and generate scam phone calls and texts. Just last month, the FBI issued a warning about a malicious messaging campaign targeting government officials and their acquaintances by sending AI-generated voice messages impersonating senior U.S. officials to gain access to their data. As challenges evolve, so too must solutions. The Committee on Energy and Commerce has been the forefront of leading discussions, understanding challenges, and developing solutions to address issues with new technologies, and we will continue to do so throughout this Congress. Notwithstanding the complex landscape, illegal scam robocalls and robotexts pose for customers, legitimate businesses, federal agencies, and their partners, I am optimistic that Republicans and Democrats will continue to work together to develop common sense bipartisan solutions to protect the American people from these fraudsters. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Thank you for taking your time to be here, and I look forward to your testimonies, and I will yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Combating the surge of unwanted robocalls and robotexts has been a priority of mine for years, and as I appreciate the Chairman Guthrie saying, in 2009 I led passage of the Trace Act, and this law has helped protect Americans from predatory and annoying robocalls and gave federal agencies better tools to fight back against fraudsters. Despite these steps, Americans are still continuously bombarded by unwanted calls and texts that are not only annoying but cause real harm through fraud and scams. Technological advancements have supercharged fraud and made it easier and less expensive for scammers to make massive numbers of robocalls, to spoof caller ID information in order to hide a caller's true identity. They also use artificial intelligence to trick consumers into thinking they're talking to a relative in financial trouble or to a trusted business offering assistance. Now, Americans received over 52 billion robocalls in 2024, which is nearly 200 calls for every American adult. Scams targeting seniors are especially rampant and take many forms, including calls or texts claiming to be from grandchildren or law enforcement or Medicare, all aimed at bilking money from the senior citizen. And robotexts are increasingly problematic, using automated text messages that trick recipients into clicking damaging links, providing personal or financial information, or paying for fraudulent items or services. And Congress has to continue to update the authorities we've given both to the FTC and the Federal Communications Commission to crack down on robocalls. We must also consider legislation focused on robotexts and provide our consumer protection agencies with adequate funding and staffing to hold bad actors accountable. The Traceback gave the FCC increased authority to require carriers to implement a call authentication framework and stepped up enforcement action against bad actors and directed carriers to develop better tools to protect their customers. But as technology evolves, fraudsters are finding new ways to scam Americans and abuse loopholes. So last Congress, I led a Democratic effort that would expand anti-robocall protections and provide explicit protections against robotexts. And our bill would have also closed loopholes exploited by scammers, combated the use of AI for scams, and alleviated the cost of robocall blocking technology for consumers. My colleagues and I are working on updates to strengthen that package, and I'm sure today's testimony will help inform our thinking on how to better protect consumers from unwanted robocalls and robotexts. Now, I'm sure there's uniform agreement on this committee that it's important to put an end to harassing and illegal robocalls and robotexts. But I have to say that actions by the Trump administration do threaten our efforts to do just that. There's a regular effort to undermine essentially what's happening is the Trump administration and, of course, the House Republicans, are cutting funding and staff from the very entities that protect consumers. And, this is all to give the big tax breaks to billionaires who don't need them. And the problem is that while law enforcement and state governments have been active in combating robocalls, and I'm working with industry to find technical solutions to address robocalls, last month, the House Republicans supported the reconciliation bill that included a 10-year moratorium on state and local enforcement of their own AI laws. So if this big tech effort becomes law, it could stop state attempts to develop innovative solutions to prevent illegal robocalls and texts. And I think it compromises America's financial well-being and hamstrung states who are working to keep their citizens safe. Federal consumer protection agencies are vital components of this fight against the robocalls and robotexts. But since taking office, President Trump has attempted to remove Senate-confirmed FTC commissioners, reduce FTC and FCC staff, and that cripples these two important agencies' efforts to protect consumers. And Democrats have advocated for stronger authority and resources for both the FTC and the FCC, and for sensible guardrails to ensure consumer safety is at the forefront of strong enforcement by federal, state, and private partners. But House Republican budgets, that have all these cuts, they're basically under-resourcing these agencies and the staff that would actually use the tools we've given them to fight against robocalls. And so I have to say, obviously this is not the way to protect consumers. And, I always worry, and I'm almost out of time, Mr. Chairman, but I just worry that, whether it's the Support Act that's on the floor this week, or it's, your efforts to talk about the need to address robocalls and texts. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have the staff, and the money is cut for these agencies, then it's not going to be effective no matter what we do as an authorizing committee. And I'm going to continually point that out because I think it's important. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, gentlemen. That concludes member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made part of the record. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before the subcommittee. You will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from the members. Our witnesses today are Joshua Bercu, Executive Director for Industry Traceback Group and Senior Vice President of USTelecom. Ms. Sarah Leggin, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for CTIA. Mr. Stephen Waguespack, President of the Institute for Legal Reform and Senior Vice President of U.S. Chamber of Federation, State and Local Advocacy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And finally, Mr. Ben Winters, Director of AI and Data Privacy for the Consumer Federation of America. We appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to hearing from you. You're aware that the committee is holding an oversight hearing, and when doing so, has the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objection to testifying under oath? Seeing no objection, we'll proceed. The chair advises you that you're entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? Seeing none, please rise and raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Seeing the witnesses answered in the affirmative, you're now sworn in and under oath, subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. You may be seated. With that, we will now recognize Mr. Bercu for 5 minutes to give an opening statement.
Chairman Palmer and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Congress's leadership in passing the Traceback Act and maintaining strong oversight remains critical to ensuring the industry and government act with urgency to address this top consumer concern. Your commitment remains vital to sustain the vigilance, innovation, and coordination needed in our continued and evolving fight against scam calls. I'm Josh Bercu, Executive Director of the Industry Traceback Group, or ITG, which is the FCC-designated Traceback Consortium under the Traceback Act, and Senior Vice President at USTelecom. Let me start with the bottom line. The Traceback Act worked. When Congress passed the Traceback Act, robocall complaints were nearing a crisis point, doubling at the FTC from 1.7 million in 2014 to nearly 4 million in 2019. Today, they're down more than 70%. FCC complaints are down 77%. That's real progress. It didn't solve everything, but we now have tools and a mandate to fight back. Over the past 6 years, we've built a framework that makes it harder and riskier for bad actors and criminals to infiltrate our networks. But it's neither hard nor risky enough, and the threat is evolving. Fraud losses are rising, not because of mass robocalls, but because of targeted, more sophisticated scams. We've gone from phishing with dynamite to precision strikes, and that demands a more agile defense. That's where Traceback has come in. Since its inception, the ITG has conducted over 20,000 tracebacks. We help identify who's behind illegal calls, whether it's a robocall campaign, a spoof threat to a high school, or a scam impersonating a bank. Our work supports law enforcement and drives action. When a rural high school in West Virginia received a threatening call, we worked with providers to trace the call path within hours, helping police confirm the call wasn't actually made locally and safely reunite families. The tools Congress empowered are as essential now as ever. Call blocking and labeling stops millions of illegal calls every day. Call authentication has made it far harder for bad actors to spoof numbers at scale. And pursuant to the Traceback Act, FCC rules now require all providers to know where their traffic comes from and take action when it's identified as unlawful, including through our tracebacks. The threat is evolving, so we need to keep evolving with the threat. The good news, we're not starting from scratch. Here are 3 things we think Congress can do to help. 1, build a unified national scam strategy. We need a national strategy and a central federal coordinator or task force to unify efforts, eliminate silos, and give industry a clear point of contact. That strategy should include international cooperation, including on Traceback. We also need to treat call-based scams for what they are, crime. And it's crime that can only be fully stopped through cross-border criminal enforcement. 2, strengthen the tools that work. Let's reinforce the existing framework. Extend the FCC's Traceback designation cycle and provide narrow immunity so we can plan, invest, and act decisively without being distracted or deterred by an annual administrative process or the risk of nuisance lawsuits. We've also worked on new tools to explore other aspects of unlawful calling campaigns, and with congressional backing, they could become permanent and powerful parts of the toolset. 3, unleash and promote cross-sector collaboration. Some of the most meaningful progress we've made has come from collaboration. We've launched a pilot with banks and carriers to trace spoof numbers pertaining to be the banks, a model of the cross-sector collaboration we need more of. But barriers can get in the way. Right now, providers may hesitate to share intelligence simply because rules and risks aren't clear. A narrowly scoped safe harbor could change that, clarifying that sharing information to prevent fraud is not only allowed, but encouraged. Blame won't stop fraud, but partnerships can. The Traceback Act was a turning point, but we need to keep adapting and fighting back. Thank you for your leadership. I look forward to your questions.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Leggin for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman, Chairman Palmer and Guthrie, Ranking Members Clark and Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of CTIA and the wireless industry, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. CTIA commends the committee for its leadership in protecting Americans from the scourge of illegal and unwanted robocalls and robotexts. Consumers rely on wireless more than ever for voice calls and text messaging. As reported last year, Americans devoted nearly 2.4 trillion minutes to voice calls, and they exchanged more than 2.1 trillion text messages. And texts have a 98% open rate, evidencing just how much consumers open and read and trust their texts. Unfortunately, bad actors know how much consumers value and rely on wireless voice and text messages. As they've increased their deceptive efforts, we've increased our efforts and our success in combating them. So today, first, I want to talk about how we're working to stop robocalls, and then I'll turn to the similar but different challenges we face when it comes to robotexts. First, on robocalls, we appreciate the committee's actions through the Trace Act to provide the FCC with new tools to combat illegal robocalls. Under this framework, the wireless industry is helping lead the way in advancing consumers' control over the voice calls they receive. Although automated calls from your pharmacy, school, or charity can be helpful and enhance consumer welfare, too many of them are intrusive and a consumer pain point. In response, the wireless industry has built a range of defenses against illegal and unwanted robocalls. We spearheaded the development of STIR/SHAKEN, Call Authentication Framework, led the way in implementing it as the Traceback directed. In addition, wireless providers and their partners have launched a variety of powerful tools to regain consumer control over the calls they receive. These include Know Your Customer practices, innovative call blocking, tracing back illegal robocalls to identify bad actors, and robust robocall mitigation programs. Wireless providers block, label, or identify over 45 billion scam calls every year, while also working hard to make sure that legitimate calls are completed. Thanks to these efforts, robocall complaints reached a 6-year low last year, and we look forward to continuing progress there. Now, turning to text messaging. Wireless text messaging is one of the most popular and trusted forms of communication among American consumers today. The wireless industry and our partners in the messaging ecosystem work really hard to keep it that way. To do so, we use proactive, multi-layered measures that include tools like upfront vetting and verification, sophisticated machine learning and AI for filtering and blocking, and consumer reporting, all balancing the need to protect consumers and ensure that legitimate texts go through. As just one metric, wireless providers blocked over 55 billion texts last year, while at the same time delivering trillions of legitimate texts. And we're always evolving our techniques to leverage the latest technology and meet new challenges. We complement these tools with best practices that offer industry-led guidance to honor consumer preferences focused on consent while supporting legitimate communications. The best practices are adopted throughout the messaging ecosystem and were recognized by a coalition of consumer advocate organizations as a critical element in protecting consumers and the messaging platform from bad actors. Notwithstanding all these efforts, bad actors continue to try to exploit consumers' trust by spamming and scamming them. So to better target those bad actors, CTIA launched the Secure Messaging Initiative, or the SMI, to convene the texting ecosystem to help identify scam activity and refer it to law enforcement for investigation. Through the SMI, we've already traced over 172,000 robotexts and made over a dozen referrals to our law enforcement partners at the FCC, FTC, DOJ, and 50 state Attorney General Enforcement Task Force. These focused on scams like student loans, government and bank impersonation, package delivery, and more. Collectively, these efforts are helping to stop scammers and maintain consumer trust in text messaging. Collaboration with our government partners is key to continued success, and we support the administration's efforts to protect consumers. Chairman Carr at the FCC has made cracking down on illegal robocalls a top priority, and we support this effort. And we acknowledge Ranking Member Pallone's Do Not Disturb bill with the goal of combating consumer fraud. Finally, we encourage Congress to take steps to support action against the bad actors behind illegal robocalls and robotexts. Many agencies are working hard to fight consumer fraud, but lack the personnel or resources to bring cases. To help out, Congress could have agencies report on their current consumer fraud resources and actions, and leverage that information to prioritize support. With more resources at the federal and state levels, Congress can help take bad actors off the field and stop illegal robocalls and robotexts at the source. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. We look forward to working with you all to protect consumers from intrusive and illegal robocalls and robotexts.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Waguespack for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Let's try that again. Thank you, Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Clark, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Stephen Waguespack, and I serve as president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for Legal Reform, more commonly known as ILR. The ILR is a division of the Chamber whose mission is to champion a fair legal system that promotes economic growth and opportunity. We believe that an effective legal system is critical to helping both customers and business owners. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the robocalling landscape and how American businesses are protecting consumers. There are 4 main points I'd like to cover in today's hearing. Number 1, legitimate businesses support and are helping to lead efforts to crack down on illegal and abusive robocalls and robotext. Businesses have every incentive to ensure that consumers continue to trust these communications. The illegal calls and texts that seek to defraud U.S. consumers begin with bad actors exploiting the reputation and goodwill of trusted American brands. For example, 1 in 3 businesses report being impersonated by scammers, with 13% reporting a switch in brands due to this deception. According to 2024 data from Hiya, 45% of consumers have received a call from someone impersonating a legitimate business, and 70% of businesses report getting a similar attack. Beyond reputational damage, fraudulent calling and texting schemes also degrade consumers' trust in these types of communications, making it difficult for businesses to engage with their customers. That's why many companies are proactively helping regulators trace these bad actors and going on the offensive by fighting back directly against them. For example, Marriott International brought its own trademark lawsuit against malicious robocallers and scored significant legal victories of both foreign and U.S.-based defendants, while DirecTV also secured a total of $8 million in judgments and broad permanent injunctions. The private sector is also devising innovative technologies such as analytics-powered software, while partnering with the government through programs like the Industry Traceback Group and Secure Messaging Initiative in tackling illegal and abusive robocalls. Number 2, more legislation will not solve the problem. Fraudulent and abusive robocalls and robotexts are already illegal. Congress must ensure that its already substantial efforts to curb these activities bear fruit by encouraging federal agencies to make illegal robocalls and robotexts an enforcement priority. As the Chamber has previously urged, lawmakers should push DOJ to prioritize enforcement against these bad actors and report annually to Congress on their efforts. There is optimism that focus on this topic could be welcomed by the DOJ, as we have seen the FCC and FTC utilizing tools like the Traceback program to increase the focus on bad actors. Number 3, and most critically, the TCPA's private rights of action provisions continue to fuel abusive litigation against American businesses. This difficult operating environment hurts both businesses and consumers and is undermining the proactive efforts by this Congress to address the very real problem of scammers. The private right of action provisions in the TCPA make it more challenging for legitimate businesses and organizations to send and for consumers to receive good calls and texts, such as appointment reminders, notifications about school closures, and other communications that consumers want. At the same time, it does not deter bad calls and texts, such as fraudulent and harassing communications that originate from bad actors. It is critical that Congress distinguish between these 2 types of calls and limit the ability of a handful of aggressive plaintiff firms to dominate the market for these suits. Congress should also encourage the FCC to simplify TCPA regulations to boost compliance, ensure certainty for legitimate businesses, and focus on addressing bad actors. 4th and finally, Congress could utilize the precedent set in other federal and state statutes to limit the abuse of private rights of action found within TCPA by implementing 1, reasonable damage caps, 2, clear safe harbor provisions, 3, limits on unreasonable attorney fees, and 4, mandatory disclosure of any usage of third-party litigation financing, known as TPLF, in these TPCA cases to ensure consumer rights are protected. The business community wants to end illegal robocalls and robotexts to foster a safe and trustworthy communications ecosystem for businesses and their consumers. As Congress considers path forward, the enforcement should be a top priority of all federal agencies, and Congress should consider reforms to prevent legitimate businesses from being ensnared in abusive TCPA litigation. Thank you for your work to date on this topic, and to the subcommittee for the opportunity to discuss these important issues. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Winters for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chair Guthrie, Ranking Member Pallone, Chair Palmer, Ranking Member Clark, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you on this important issue. I'm Ben Winters. I'm the Director of AI and Privacy at the Consumer Federation of America, or CFA. CFA is an association of nonprofit consumer organizations established in 1968 to advance the consumer interest through research, advocacy, and education. There is a staggering amount of monetary and emotional harm caused by scams perpetrated through robocalls and robotexts. Consumers lost over $12.5 billion to scams last year, which was a 20% increase from 2023. Even when no money is lost, there's a constant sense of annoyance and need for vigilance. Americans received an estimated 19.2 billion robotexts and 5 billion robocalls last month alone. And just this morning, the Washington Post featured the fact that there's a 5 times jump in scam losses from schemes that started in tech since 2020. In this testimony, I'll be highlighting how underregulated technologies like AI are making these problems worse, how federal consumer protection agencies can be doing more, and how Congress can act to protect consumers from this annoying and dangerous problem. Generative AI reduces the time and effort criminals have to expend in order to deceive their targets. Products like ChatGPT can create quick and unique human-sounding scripts that can be sent in text or read by humans or AI-generated voices, and it's easy to make variations that make them difficult to spot. In CFA's recent Scamplified report, we illustrate how easy it is to use ChatGPT to generate text with an urgent ask to add $50 worth of Bitcoin to a wallet. It spat out 30, 50, 100 texts with common women's names and real hospitals in common U.S. cities to create urgency. It even continued to spit out text when we asked it to target it with someone that might have dementia. And it's not just text generators. Voice cloning tools can now replicate anyone's speech using just a few seconds from a phone call or a podcast interview. Scammers have exploited this to impersonate loved ones, such as in grandparent scams you've already heard about today. Consumer Reports investigation showed popular voice cloning platforms don't require the user to verify their identity or gain consent before creating these voice clonings. Beyond AI, there's a host of companies in what we call the scam stack, all of which are fueling an increase in scams. These include data brokers that that sell data en masse based on people's behavior, purchases, relationships, location, and more, automated content delivery, things like we're talking about today, and methods of reporting which can be improved to bridge the gap between a victim and the authorities that could help. Federal consumer protection agencies tasked with stopping scam robotexts and robocalls like the FCC and FTC are being stripped down and distracted. The consequence is stark. In April, the Department of Justice eliminated their consumer protection branch entirely. This is the branch that brought a landmark criminal case against a data broker that sold over 30 million records of elderly Americans that was then used to perpetrate a scam. This type of enforcement of upstream actors is exactly what we need to see, and it's troubling to see that agency get axed. Americans deserve an FCC that is focused on the complicated robocall ecosystem, and they have done a lot to try to address it. But the agency leadership right now seems focused on controlling the speech and hiring practices of entertainment companies that are perceived to be the enemies of the president instead of ramping up rulemaking and enforcement as an independent agency. Chairman Carr's Delete, Delete, Delete initiative, in which he is asking the American public what regulations the FCC should delete because they stand in the way of expansion and technological innovation, is illustrative of its disastrous deregulatory approach that doesn't even mention consumer protection. At the FTC, the firing of key staff and critically 2 of the 5 commissioners have left the agency ill-equipped to protect American consumers. The agency must finalize the individual impersonation rule so they can deter and enforce violations of widespread things like voice cloning, like they have started to do with government and business impersonation, which they finalized last year. Both agencies must prioritize enforcement against upstream actors, such as voice service providers and AI developers, who knowingly facilitate these harmful practices. These intermediaries are critical to how illegal calls and texts scale and are essential to meaningful accountability. Congress has to hold upstream actors accountable, as just like I talked about, strengthen enforcement tools beyond just what's in the Trace Act, increase transparency, and mandate consequences for known bad actors throughout the call path. We also urge Congress to increase funding for state enforcement, pass privacy laws restricting data brokers, and require responsible AI moderation and transparency. One thing Congress absolutely should not do right now is pass a moratorium on regulating AI at the state level. The scale of these problems is one of many reasons it's not the time to do this, and if states can create transparency or establish appropriate liability, we should welcome it, embracing the critical roles of states not only to protect consumers, but be the laboratory of democracy. Right now, the FTC, FCC, and CFPB risk being cops off of their beat, and Congress must empower them, resource them, and restore them in order to aggressively protect consumers. The American people deserve nothing less. Thanks again for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
I thank you all for your testimony. We will now move on to questioning. I will begin and recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bercu, the Broadband Association's Industry Traceback Group conducted more than 3,600 tracebacks of suspected unlawful robocalls in 2024. Generally speaking, what percentage of unlawful robocalls are foreign originated?
Thank you for the question. So I don't have an exact number on how many came from foreign countries or foreign entities, but we do know that a lot of the fraud does come from abroad. Illegal telemarketing, we see that sometimes originate at home, sometimes abroad, but a lot of the fraud does originate overseas. And one of the things we've been seeing a lot lately is because so much of enforcement and regulation was focused on who brought the illegal call into the country, what we're now seeing is some of the bad actors spinning out U.S.-based LLCs so that we're tracing it to a U.S. entity that probably has no people in the United States at all.
Do we, dealing with the foreign actors, though, it creates some tremendous challenges because we can't charge them with a crime right now unless they're operating in country. Is there any recourse through civil action? I mean, what recourse do you have to deal with foreign actors? And be as brief as you can.
Yeah, I think we can do criminal action, and I think that needs to be a priority. The same people attacking us here are attacking other countries as well. I think there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration. And just to give you one anecdote, when the FBI did work several years ago with the Central Bureau of Intelligence in India to raid some of the call centers there, we saw IRS robocalls drop 80% overnight.
Okay. Ms. Leggin, can you tell us how CTIA's Secure Messaging Initiative works to trace back robotext, and how effective has this been to stop illegal unwanted robotext?
Thank you for the question. CTIA's Secure Messaging Initiative was launched to convene the messaging ecosystem and the various players that have a role there in protecting consumers so that we can facilitate information sharing among the industry stakeholders to complement their existing industry tools to better fight the bad actors, and then to share that information with law enforcement partners at the FCC, FTC, DOJ, and the 50-state Attorney General Enforcement Task Force. To date, we've done over 172,000 robotexts as part of those information packages that we share with law enforcement, and we've done over a dozen of those packages that focus on scams that you all have seen, including government or bank impersonation, package delivery, and AI-enhanced scams as well. We continue to focus on the areas where we're hearing that scams are happening for consumers so that we give that information to law enforcement so they can prioritize their efforts to go after the bad actors and stop the traffic at the source.
Mr. Bercu, I want to go back to you. How widely has the stir, shake, and caller ID authentication framework been implemented, and what percentage of the providers still need to implement the framework?
So under FCC rules, it's implemented on the IP portions of providers' networks, and we've seen a shift in practice because of especially the high-volume illegal telemarketers. One of the things, I think because of stir shaking, have moved away from spoofing to actually getting real numbers, which stir shaking doesn't directly address.
Okay, Mr. Waguespack, in your testimony, you were talking about how the private right of action has been abused, and it's harmed by illegal and scam harmed by illegal. It's been abused instead of protecting people who've been harmed by scam robocalls. It's led to basically a cottage industry that's attacking legitimate companies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, in the statements from the opening statements from the panel, then obviously from the witnesses here, there seems to be a unified focus that these bad actors, a lot of times, which are very hard to find, which are located overseas, those are the true ones driving a lot of this issue. The private right of action provisions within TCPA are not utilized to go after those bad actors. Instead, a cottage industry is developed to go after simply where there's opportunities to make money. And also the provisions of the PRA within TCPA are extremely broad compared to other federal statutes. There's no cap, there's no caps on recovery as you see in HIPAA, no safe harbor provision you see in COPPA, no cap on attorney fees as you see in other statutes. And so it's created a class action factory that's being exploited by just a handful of firms and a lot of
It's become a predatory use of the private right of action. I saw where one of the judgments was for $260-something million. So how do we respond to that?
I think we borrow from other statutes already in place at the federal level. You look to HIPAA to put a cap on the total recovery. They set that at $25,000. There's no cap here. It's up to $15,000 per occurrence under this statute, which absolutely drives those numbers up. And most of these suits, they're not trying to win in court. They're just trying to drive discovery to make it very expensive and drive settlement. And you're seeing it play out time and time again. In fact, there's one law firm that has done over 155 cases over a 3-year period on this front. They've developed a niche market. There's even one plaintiff who has done almost 125 himself on this issue. So you have a handful of folks exploiting this system. That's not helping the consumers that desperately need some of the help from these scam robocalls.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes for her question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unwanted calls continue to be the top consumer complaint received by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. In 2024, Americans received over 52 billion robocalls, and 49% of those robocalls were scams or from telemarketers. Mr. Bercu, how has the robocall and robotext threat landscape changed since the implementation of the Traced Act and Stir and Shaken?
So I think we've made a lot of progress, but as you're recognizing, there's work left to do. We have seen complaints, they're still too high, but they've dropped pretty dramatically from the highs from several years ago. We've seen some of the bad actors, instead of for scam robocalls, there's some day they're about 50% of what they once were for scam robocalls, but we've seen the scammers move from mass robocalls to more targeted, more sophisticated attacks where they know exactly who they're calling. So that's a little bit of how this has changed over time.
Well, thank you. So we still have more to do. With the work left undone in the fight against phone scams, it baffles me that the Trump administration is undermining the government institutions that combat them. In March, President Trump attempted to illegally remove Senate-confirmed commissioners from the Federal Trade Commission, an independent agency with the explicit mission to protect the public from unfair and deceptive business practices like unlawful telemarketing and robocalls. And in April, in accordance with the Trump administration instruction, the Department of Justice announced plans to dissolve its Consumer Protection Branch, which tries cases targeting large-scale scams against seniors, AI, and cybercrimes against consumers, and illegal telemarketing. This just makes no sense. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, FCC, FTC, and the Department of Justice have all been hit by early retirements, terminations, and deferred resignations, and they are all agencies that combat the robocall problem we are gathered to discuss today. Mr. Winters, how does an unstable and depleted FCC and FTC workforce impact the role both agencies play in addressing the robocall scams?
Thanks for the question. These under-resourced consumer protection agencies is just a big win for scammers, right? Less cops on the beat mean less consequences, and they can sort of act with impunity. And so what we need to be doing, and I think was reflected in all of our testimony today, is that we need more enforcement, more resources, and more proactive behavior. And everything about from firing commissioners to budget cuts goes exactly against that.
Thank you. Last week, President Trump released a detailed fiscal year 2026 funding proposal. If enacted, this proposal would make permanent and add to the number of fired federal employees, including 74 at the FCC, 83 at the FTC, and 32 of which are identified as consumer protection roles. The proposal also cuts $42 million from the FTC and more than $18 million of which would go directly toward protecting consumers. Mr. Winters, what would happen to the robocall fighting infrastructure if the federal government pulled back from its role, whether it be from a lack of manpower, funds, or general disinterest in holding scammers accountable?
In the interest of time, I'll be simple in that it will get worse.
And what do the government actions we have discussed today tell the scammers and fraudsters who conduct robocalls and texts about the priorities of the U.S. government? Do you think actions like these make robocalls more likely to occur in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it incentivizes bad behavior. It makes people feel like we are absolutely not going to be able to, we're not going to get enforcement action against us. It's going to be hard to track. It's hard to track when you have a full court press against it, and we've seen that for years. But if we're pulling back, then that's even, an unimaginable harm for American consumers.
Very well. Well, Mr. Chairman, in their written testimony, several of today's witnesses said Congress must increase support for and prioritize enforcement actions if we truly want to stop bad actors. The experts are calling for more funding and enforcement, not less. And I ask my colleagues across the aisle to listen to them. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Clark. Next is Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you. I thank all the witnesses for being here. I appreciate you all being here this morning. And so, Mr. Bercu, in July of 2020, the FCC first selected USTelecom, the Broadband Association's industry Traceback group, as the single registered consortium to conduct private-led traceback efforts, and has redesigned USTelecom's ITG each year since. So could you kind of explain, I know I'm going between two hearings, so if you're repetitive, it helps me to repeat anyway. So how does Traceback work, and how has the USTelecom ITG helped the FCC with its efforts to fight illegal robocalls?
Yeah, absolutely. So Traceback helped solve for one of the problems which was when a call is spoofed, and we don't know where it's coming from. The carrier doesn't know exactly where it came from. StirShaken helps with that, but Traceback goes even farther, and we go hop by hop in a semi-automated system through a portal, and we find out exactly where it's coming from. And in fact, in our Tracebacks have identified over 2,000 providers from 75 different countries. So we'll trace it all over the world till we can find out who's making the calls and actually disrupt it there. Our data has been used for virtually every robocall enforcement by the FCC, by the FTC, by the state AGs. So it's been a very successful partnership with the industry and government.
Well, shouldn't the technology be in place? Let's say if I'm sitting in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and a phone call's coming from Nigeria that's not in my data in my cell phone or anything like that, should that be blocked? I mean, there's technology that can block that from coming. I mean, you have to sign up for it, I gather, but there's technology that keeps that from coming to your phone, doesn't it?
So the challenge is that there's not perfect information at the carrier side about where that call is coming from. StirShaken helps with that. I'm optimistic that a recent rule clarification the FCC did last year that will continue to advance StirShaken and the impact there. So, but that's the challenge, and so there's definitely tools to achieve that, but the carriers don't have perfect information to know that call was coming from Nigeria.
Well, my understanding is that when a lot of these robocalls happen, they're not like I'm calling Neil Dunn in Florida and faking him out or something. I'm a criminal in Bowling Green calling Neil Dunn in Florida. It's usually spam is just thousands of calls instantaneously going out. Can carriers not determine that and block those calls?
So that type, that it still happens, but that's at a fraction of what it once was, thanks to enforcement, thanks to the Trace Act, thanks to StirShaken. Those types of calls are down, depending on the data you look, about 50%. Mm-hmm. Where we've seen fraud calls, a lot of the robocalls that people still hate, a lot of those are illegal telemarketing. That's the majority of the robocalls people get, where it's telemarketing that no one consented to, and they're violating the TCPA. But what we're seeing with the scams are getting more sophisticated, more targeted, where they are targeting individuals.
Okay, so Ms. Leggin, could you talk about how the CTIA is trying to help fight these spam calls and robocalls?
Sure thing. Thank you for the question. As Josh said,
I think you probably need your mic. I know. There you go.
Try that again.
Yeah, perfect. It was on?
Is it on now?
Or maybe just closer to it. Yeah, closer to it.
Sorry. Can't see if it's on or not.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Like Josh's members, the wireless industry are dedicated to protecting consumers from illegal and unwanted robocalls. We helped lead the way in developing the StirShaken framework, and we supported this committee's efforts through the Trace Act to promote the deployment of that. And it's now working well as a call authentication tool to help protect consumers from spoofed calls. It's just one tool in the toolbox, though, so especially over the last few years, we've been developing lots of different call blocking, labeling, filtering tools to complement StirShaken as part of a multi-pronged approach to protect consumers from robocalls. At CTIA, we're developing the next generation of call authentication, which is branded calling, or our CTIA's BC ID, or branded calling ID, which gives consumers even more information about who's calling and why, to help empower consumers about whether to answer the phone again. as well as protecting them by providing consumer resources that educate them about which calls to ignore, so that we're kind of coming at it from all fronts.
I assume that could be a competitive thing between providers to say, hey, if you use our service, we can help you block your robocalls. I assume that would be. So, Mr. Waguespack, how about increasing fines for illegal robocalls? Would such a change affect the legitimate businesses, and how can we improve collection of existing fines or overall enforcement?
Sorry, my phone just spoke, ironically. You know, obviously, FCC and FTC, I think, have done a really great job working with industry partners to develop through Traceback and other initiatives to identify those. So we definitely encourage strong enforcement and add that DOJ should also go after these bad actors any way we can. We think going through those channels as compared to unleashing a small niche cadre of plaintiff firms to go after, quite frankly, credible businesses just because they can't find the bad actors has been the wrong minor approach within TCPA. So it's that private right of action that truly we think is a disincentive to businesses to reach out to develop those partnerships with their consumers that, quite frankly, most of their consumers want.
Okay, thank you. Well, my time's expired, and I'll yield back. Appreciate you all being here. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next up is the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you so much. And look, I think we all know we have to do more to stop these dangerous and unwanted calls and texts that continue to bombard Americans. I mean, I get so many myself every day, and they're not just harassment, they're causing real harms. The phone scams alone defrauded Americans of $25 billion in 2023. Now, the Traceback, which I authored in 2019, required the implementation of the stir, shake, and call authentication technology to help verify the legitimacy of calls. So I wanted to ask Mr. Bercu, you run the industry Traceback group, which traces calls to the origin as required by the Traceback on behalf of the communications industry. In your testimony, you discuss how industry is utilizing this framework to fight the problem of robocalls and to protect consumers from scam artists. What more can industry do to protect consumers from unwanted and dangerous robocalls and robotexts? I'm going to ask you a question, and then Mr. Winters, so a couple of minutes.
Sure. So thank you for the question, Ranking Member Pallone. I think the industry, we do have blocking and labeling deployed. We do stir shaking is deployed. I think there's a lot of work there, but I think what our experience shows is that when we're dealing with whether it's the illegal telemarketers, whether it's the criminal fraudsters abroad, they don't stop because it gets a little bit harder. This is their business, so they keep trying to find new paths. So I think what we see with Traceback, we are tracing them back. We've adapted to tracing back the targeted scam calls, working closely with the financial sector, other sectors as well. And I think that's more of the work to be done, complemented by very aggressive enforcement against the actual bad actors.
Oh, thank you. So in March, President Trump illegally, in my opinion, fired the 2 Democratic FTC commissioners, meaning that their crucial voices are missing from any discussion at FTC of how to better protect consumers from robocalls and robotexts. And they have my full support in their ongoing lawsuit to be rightfully restored at the FTC, and I think that's the very first step that needs to be taken. But just last year, I introduced and I mentioned also the Do Not Disturb Act, a comprehensive piece of legislation that aims to build on the success of the Trace Act, and it would ensure that scam artists using illegal robocalls or robotexts can't exploit new loopholes, as new technology makes it even easier for fraudsters to steal from Americans. So, Mr. Winters, I have 2 questions. You've got 2 minutes. Do you agree there's a need for legislation to provide update to current laws, like last year's Do Not Disturb Act? And do the FTC and FCC need more authority from Congress to fight text message scams? Is it just money and enforcement, or do they actually need more authority, if you will?
Thank you. Yeah, so on that first question, I think there's a lot more that Congress can do, and there's more that they need to do. And so whether that is some of the provisions in the Do Not Disturb Act, like codifying the rule about AI disclosures and increasing penalties for AI-generated scam calls, there is a lot more that can be done by Congress, including giving more resources to not just FCC, but to state attorneys general who are leading the forefront of a lot of this work, and increasing collaboration.
But do they need more authority, though?
They do need more authority. One thing in particular is that they're not able to directly collect fines. They have to refer fine collection to the Department of Justice, and so they have to rely on another overworked agency to collect fines. And we see a lot of times, although there are big headlines and numbers of fines, the FCC might not actually be able to resolve and get a lot of that money back. So that's one thing that needs to be done in terms of authority. And they also need the authority to put more automatic suspension and provisions in the robocall mitigation database, so that when there are repeat bad actors, they are automatically taken out. They can't just stay in the robocall mitigation database. There is not enough sort of continued standards and continued enforcement using that.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, as you can see, I think there's a question of more authority that's needed for the agencies. But I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is they also need more resources and staff, and cutting back on staff and firing, some of the commissioners is certainly not the way to go if you really want to try to improve the situation with robocalls. And so, I would not only ask that we try to move towards more authority to fight these scams, but also, provide the resources, not cut the resources, not cut the staff. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. I'm up next, so welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're able to join us. Ms. Leggin, I will direct my questions to you this morning. According to the FCC, text message scams have increased 500-fold in recent years. How have scams become more sophisticated over the years?
Thanks for the question. CTIA and our members are dedicated to protecting consumers from scam and spam text messages, while also making sure that legitimate ones go through, because we know that consumers open and read and trust their text messages as one of the most preferred platforms for communications today. Over the years, we have seen bad actors increasingly target text messaging because they know that consumers open and read those texts. So as bad actors have evolved and enhanced their tactics, we've evolved and enhanced our defenses as well. So over the years, we've enhanced our blocking, filtering tools by enhancing them with machine learning and AI. We've launched the Secure Messaging Initiative, which is our work to partner with law enforcement to give them actionable information about bad actors so that they can go and take traffic off at the source. And those are working to help the FCC, the FTC, DOJ, and the Attorney General Enforcement Task Force in giving them information they can go after bad actors with.
Okay, thank you very much. You also answered my follow-up. Are mobile carriers and other industry players doing enough to address the growth in scam and illegal robotext?
Our industry is really dedicated to this issue. As just one metric, we've blocked over 55 billion texts last year, while also making sure that the legitimate ones go through and supporting over 2 trillion legitimate texts. So it really is always a balance, but we've dedicated a lot of different resources to enhancing our protections against bad actors. In terms of more things we can do, again, we welcome help from Congress in prioritizing resources towards enforcement so that the agencies we work with can take on more of those cases, do more investigations, and go after the bad actors to stop that traffic at the source.
All right, thank you. How well are mobile carriers engaging with states and other entities for information sharing and enforcement? For example, with the scam toll text, did mobile carriers pause delivery and contact state toll authorities to verify the legitimacy of the numbers?
Our members were focused on the toll road scams as well as the other versions of that as part of our work to protect consumers from all those types of scams that impersonate legitimate businesses. The wireless carriers, as well as other partners in the messaging ecosystem, including providers of other types of messaging apps that were targeted by that type of scam, including over-the-top, online-based, and app-based messaging, all were working together to share information with law enforcement to help them find the bad actors responsible and take them off the field.
Okay, thank you. How can we get mobile carriers to better engage and pull their weight to stop the flood of robotext at the same level as robocalls? At the same level they did for robocalls, I'm sorry.
The wireless industry and our messaging ecosystem partners are really focused on this issue. For years, we have been seeing bad actors really target the voice network because there were not blocking and other protections in place until the last few years. In text messaging, we've actually had the ability to block and to filter and to employ upfront vetting and verification for decades. And so for a long time, the messaging platform was really protected from bad actors. Of course, bad actors are getting more sophisticated and over the last few years targeting text messaging more. But this has been an area of focus and a priority for our members for years, and we continue to dedicate significant resources toward protecting consumers while maintaining trust in text messaging.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back my remaining time. Next up is the gentlelady from Colorado, Mrs. DeGette.
Thank you so much. So I just got back, along with many of our colleagues on this committee, from a conference on artificial intelligence. And so I'd like to talk with you about that today, because I think it's really being implemented in a disturbing way by scammers to find new ways to deal with Americans. A lot of us have been hearing these chilling stories about how somebody gets called by somebody who they think is their child or their parent and asked for money, and the voice sounds eerily like their loved one. So, Mr. Winters, I want to ask you, how has AI technology been used to create more sophisticated robocall and robotext scams that target consumers?
Thanks for the question. It's been in a lot of different ways, and so I'll categorize the two different types of AI systems in it. So one in text generation services, like sort of I mentioned in my opening statement, whether it's something like ChatGPT or Claude that you might have played around with, or one of the one that even has less moderation, you can create a bunch of texts really quickly that have good grammar, and it seems like you don't have the bells going off in your head from them. So you can do that. You can have a list of people's names, target based off their location, other information you have it connect to a link of a wallet or a Zelle or something like that. So it's just a sort of scale and accuracy and plausibility thing. The other big category is the sort of impersonation of people, whether that be through voice or video, and that's where you see the really harrowing stories of sort of like real-time fraud and deepfake stuff that have not only caused a lot of emotional harm, but have sort of ruined people's lives. Yeah.
Yeah, so this kind of goes without saying, but because of this degree of sophistication, even when you have an educated consumer, it becomes much more difficult to identify these scams.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that one thing is it's really difficult and kind of an impossible proposition to have all American people be able to spot when something is AI in the moment and then not respond to the emotional sort of I'm your son and I'm in jail thing, even if you are able to flag that. And then not all AI generated anything will be a scam or a fraud, so it's complicated there because you don't necessarily want to teach that. It'll just get people paranoid. So it's really should be on the companies and on the enforcement
agencies. So if we're not going to rely on the consumers by education, Ms. Leggin, what more can industry do to filter these messages and prevent them from ever getting to the victims?
So as Mr. Winters said, it's a balanced approach to make sure that we're blocking the messages that we don't want consumers to receive and they don't want to receive, while also making sure that legitimate ones go through.
That's right.
So with AI-enhanced scams, for example, there are aspects of that we can also detect using AI by analyzing vaster quantities of data, by enhancing our existing tools and algorithms and frameworks, and then by complementing those with large fraud teams to help protect consumers from scams.
And do you think that the federal agencies have the necessary authorities to fight against these scams, or can companies do it themselves? Do they have the authority to do it?
We value our partnerships with all the law enforcement entities, including the FCC, FTC.
Right.
DOJ.
Do you think they have enough authority to do it?
We think
yes or no will work.
We think that the best way for them to continue to help us is by prioritizing resources towards enforcement.
Resources. So that means Congress and the administration have to adequately fund them, right?
We continue to work with
No,
our
no,
partners.
yes or no will work.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Winter, do you think they have enough authorities?
No.
And why is that?
I mean, if they did and they had the resources as well, I think we probably would not be here today. They need an ability to, as I mentioned, follow up on the fines that they levy and actually collect those. They need sort of required transparency and basic moderation challenges, obligations for AI companies. There are lots of things that just using something like unfair deceptive practices authority are
Okay,
unequipped.
thanks. We look forward to working with you to see
Definitely.
what new authorities we want. I just have a little time left, so I want to ask you one more question. In the bill, the great big bill a couple of weeks ago that we're now learning all of the things that were included, one of the things that was included in the reconciliation package was a 10-year moratorium on state and local enforcement of their own AI bills. Does a 10-year moratorium on state AI bills prevent states from using evolving technologies to help fight this program? And do you think that's something Congress should look at, Mr. Winters?
So we vehemently oppose the moratorium provision. I don't think the moratorium as written would stop state agencies from using AI, but it would harm consumers without a doubt.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Next up is my good friend, Mr. Griffith from Virginia.
Let me start in a little bit different direction than I planned on going. Ms. Leggin, you were asked about adequate funding a minute ago, and I got the sense that while you were told to give a yes or no answer, you want to see the Federal Trade Commission and others receive adequate funding, but it seemed to me that you were not trying to get into the debate as to what the definition of adequate funding is. Am I correct that I read your body language correctly, that you didn't want to get into that debate, but you do want them to be adequately funded?
That's right. It's up to each agency to allocate resources to their enforcement teams. But what we've said is, and what we're seeing with our work with our enforcement partners, is that sometimes the consumer fraud protection folks lack the personnel or resources they need to go after cases. So we welcome information collection or just a way to try to allocate the existing resources.
But it's also true that AI may make this much more efficient, and so we're looking forward to that too. Is that not correct?
That's right. AI
All right.
poses.
I got to move on to what I really was going to go after,
Sure.
both for you and Mr. Bercu. The good news is that the fraud, while terrible, is on the downward slope, and I hear from my constituents all the time about receiving robocalls. And a couple of years ago, it was all about the fraudulent stuff, and they were concerned about that. But I will tell you, in the last year, particularly in the last few months, the real concern has become Medicare, and particularly Medicare Advantage solicitors, calling up the folks in my district, and I have an older population, generally speaking, than most districts, and they're just driving them crazy with all these calls. And a 2023 survey estimated that 30% of Medicare Advantage eligible beneficiaries receive 7 or more calls a week. I got to tell you, Mr. Chairman and witnesses, I've had constituents who've told me if they only got 7 a day, they'd be thrilled. That would be a down number. So what can we do, because this is a huge issue in my district, what can we do to make that situation better?
Yeah, I think that those calls, if they're robocalls, if they're telemarketing calls, if they may be in violation of the TCPA, they may be violation of the telemarketing sales rule.
So how do we get them to use, because I've said to folks as I've been talking with them, well, have you put yourself on the do not call list? And they say, yes, but it doesn't seem to change anything. So how do we make that better?
I mean, so one of the things is, and we'd be happy to work with you, we've got to trace
Please.
back those calls. We have to see who is ignoring the law, get that information, get that to the right enforcement authorities to go after them. And we've seen success with that, like the auto warranty campaign was the same. We worked very closely with the states and the FCC, and that went from the most prolific robocall campaign in America to basically zero right now. So that's the answer there.
All right, well, I'll be glad to work with you anyway, because, when I start going to events and I start hearing this at a majority of the events I go to, whether it be a street festival or a meeting of folks, that tells me we got a problem. Ms. Leggin, I got the toll texts. Of course, I called my staff assistant and said, how come you haven't kept my account up to date? Not realizing I was on the road, and she said, it's a scam, don't worry about it. But I've gotten a number of those things since then, and some others, and apparently somebody out there thinks I need a new job. And I click delete or report as junk and delete. Does that do any good?
It certainly does. That's one of the key tools that the wireless industry and our partners on the device side have made available for consumers to delete, report junk. You can also forward your scam text to 7726, which spells spam. And both of those are key inputs for wireless providers and our messaging partners in making our algorithms and filtering and blocking more sophisticated and responsive to what we're hearing from consumers out there, like you and others in this room that have gotten those types of texts. In addition, we look at those types of scams and we develop evidence on them and refer them to our law enforcement partners for investigation through our secure messaging initiative as well, so that we're working to target the bad actors responsible.
All right, I appreciate that. Mr., and I hope I get your name right, Waguespack?
Pretty good, yeah.
All right, it's not too bad. I don't know that I really have a question for you, but I'll just make a comment. As a recovering attorney, I hate the whole strike suit industry where they get a niche and they just go after things. I want people to be able to sue when they're legitimately harmed. And I just make the offer that if I can work with you in any way to try to make the law so that it lets the legitimate complaint go forward, but stops the strike suits where they're just trying to make it expensive and get a settlement. You talked about that earlier. Just let me know what I can do to be of assistance. I will try.
I appreciate that. That's the balance we're looking for, and the balance is found in other federal statutes all across the code.
All right, I appreciate you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Griffiths. Next up is Mrs. Trahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm glad to know that the frustration of unwanted robocalls is as universal in Congress as it is with our constituents. According to one estimate, Massachusetts residents received over 43 million robocalls in the month of May alone. Each of these unwanted calls wastes the precious time of the people we represent, and there are real risks that the caller on the other end is a scammer looking to swindle them out of hundreds or even thousands of dollars. The scourge of robocalls and robotexts must end, and yet the Trump administration does seem determined to cut enforcement agencies like the FCC and the FTC who fight for Americans every single day. Mr. Winters, can you just explain in brief the role that the FCC plays in combating robocalls and texts and how this agency works with private sector partners to do that?
Sure, thanks for the question. The FCC has a lot of responsibility and a lot of a big thing to cover, but one of the things they do is maintain and establish the robocall mitigation database. They have enforcement and investigation teams for reading consumer complaints, taking them in, analyzing it, and trying to do enforcement when possible. And I think they also, work with industry colleagues who maybe I'll speak more to that to try to ensure that they're doing as much as they can. But I think that already, and even when there was no cuts to staffing, it's really hard for them to actually make meaningful consequences for the repeat bad actors, whether it's their inability to get the fines themselves or just the fact that there is a relatively low standard for the robocall mitigation database. There are all sorts of reasons why, even if fully staffed, they don't quite have the right authorities or the right approach. And so, to cut their staffing would make it even harder.
Thank you. In February, President Trump signed the Executive Order 142-15, incorrectly named Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies. This EO strips the independence from many of our regulatory agencies, including the FCC. And the FCC is essential in the fight against illegal robocalls, making the actions of the Trump administration all the more concerning. Mr. Winters, again, what effects will there be in the fight against illegal robocalls and texts if the Trump administration undermines the independence of federal agencies like the FCC?
Thanks. The independent nature of the FCC and the FTC both is essential for them to be able to focus on consumer protection and not go down political pursuits. I highlighted a little bit in my oral and wrote more about it in my written testimony, but particularly at the FCC, this relationship with the White House has taken priority and makes it so Chairman Carr is most of the time talking about DEI hiring practices at companies and threatening to pull licenses for airing interviews with Democratic candidates, for example, as well as, just focusing on, providing contracts for people like Elon Musk in getting spectrum lines. All of that focus is not on consumer protection, right? And one of the reasons why is because of that lack of independence, where they can't focus on that because they're focusing on the priorities of the president.
Thank you. The FCC's budget justification lists cracking down on illegal robocalls as a performance indicator for the agency, which is a necessary priority. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has doubled down on its mission to hamstring the federal government's ability to hold robocall scammers accountable by proposing to eliminate 74 positions at the FCC in the fiscal year 2026 budget. The FCC, however, is not alone in fighting robocalls. Industry has in many instances implemented solutions and voluntarily adopted best practices. Yes, they can always do more, but as lawmakers, we should look to build upon their good work while identifying gaps where the federal government can add value. Ms. Leggin, can you discuss the importance of public-private partnerships in combating robocalls and robotexts and suggest specific ways in which Congress can accelerate the efforts that industry has already taken?
Thank you. Public-private partnerships are a key tool in helping us go after bad actors so that we're stopping robocalls and robotexts at the source. CTIA's members participate in the USTelecom Industry Traceback group to help identify the bad actors behind illegal robocalls. And our members on the wireless side and then also throughout the messaging ecosystem participate in CTIA's Secure Messaging Initiative, which convenes the messaging ecosystem to share information among each other and with our law enforcement partners across the federal agencies and with the State Attorney General Enforcement Task Force so that they can take that information and go after the bad actors as well.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Next up is the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding today's hearing, and thank you for all of the witnesses who have agreed to testify today. When I return to my district, Pennsylvania's 13th Congressional District, I hear about the pervasive and unrelenting illegal robocalls and texts that my constituents are faced with, often on a daily basis. So many of my constituents are senior citizens. I sat down and did a senior citizen seminar twice in the district in the last month. And you hear recurrent themes. You hear the grandma, it's Mike, I'm in Mexico and I'm in jail. I need your help. I need it. It sounded just like Mike. I hear that repeatedly when I have these roundtable discussions with seniors. And it seems like the scammers are getting creative and finding actually new ways to trick us with incredible looking text messages and very convincing grandma and grandpa calls. Scammers have even learned how to incorporate AI into intimidating loved ones to convince them to turn over personal information, credit card numbers, bank numbers. Too many of my constituents are risking their retirement savings, and subsequently, they lose faith in the system that we have set in place to protect them. We need to do better. We need to both educate consumers and anticipate the next angle of attack that these scammers will take, particularly with the assistance of our partners in law enforcement and the DOJ. Mr. Bercu, your testimony mentioned a project piloted by the Industry Traceback Group, ITG, in partnership with banks and carriers, aimed at tackling fraud and consumer financial losses. Can you elaborate on the pilot goals and successes thus far, and is there collaboration with law enforcement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the most promising work our industry is doing is partnering across sectors because the fraudsters are hurting our collective customers, whether that's banks or the carriers and your constituents. So what we've been doing is working with banks to help them identify where their number has been spoofed and a few carriers. So working with the carriers, getting examples of calls that the carriers see from the bank's number, getting that back to the bank, and the bank can tell us, oh, those weren't us. And what we're doing with that is two things. We're able to trace that back, find out who made the calls, find out who was spoofing the number, get that information in the hands of law enforcement to take action with it, but also help the bank identify and look at those customers and say, oh, did any of these customers that got the fake call pretending to be us have a suspicious transaction, and helping to find that. And I think criminal enforcement has to be a key here because we know the scammers will use any tool available to them, and they won't stop just because it gets a little harder. They keep evolving, and so the key is going after them, and we stand ready to continue to support that.
And I agree. The scammers certainly have the ability to be incredibly crafty, devious, and downright evil in this regard. Talk to me about how you interface with financial institutions to make them aware of these situations.
So I think that's actually one of the promising things going on across the industry is that we work directly with a lot of the financial institutions. We work with tech companies, others. Marriott was mentioned before. We worked very closely with Marriott to trace the calls pertaining to be Marriott. So that's what we're doing, but there's broader conversations now about how the industries can even keep growing and continue to integrate. In my opening testimony, one thing I mentioned I think Congress can do to help here is a safe harbor for that fraud information sharing, because I think there are questions about rules and risks when you do share information. So I think that's one way we can continue to unlock those good partnerships.
And thank you. Thank you for being proactive in this. Mr. Waguespack, many of my constituents are in rural central Pennsylvania, where internet connectivity is difficult and educational digital resources on illegal robocalls are inaccessible. How can federal agencies and industry partner, coordinate efforts to better educate consumers, specifically in rural areas with limited internet access in those digital resources?
Well, I think on leaning into what has been done since TCPA was first initiated, where you have private sector solutions going in and working with, we've talked a lot about FCC and FTC, but also the local law enforcement and local financial institutions on the ground there, putting that initiative out there. Mr. Bercu talked about some of the information sharing that are done with the banks to prevent the fraud. There's also a second level down. It's a good example of the education program. Through the Bankers Association, they've armed about 2,000 banks out there to talk to their consumers. Here's a hit list of the things we will never ask you for. So if you get an email that has this, or this, ignore it, it's spam. Here's how you call us back. And so we can use the private sector, I think, to develop some of that messaging and make sure consumers can be informed of the decisions they need to be able to fight back on their own.
I thank all of the witnesses for presenting here today. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired and I yield back.
Thank you. Next up is a gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Fletcher.
Well, thank you. And thanks to our Chairman Palmer and Ranking Member Clark for convening this hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses for all of your testimony. I think it's been really helpful for all of us, and as we've heard throughout the morning, abusive robocalls and robotexts are not just a nuisance, right? They're a danger, and we need to do something about that. I appreciate the work that you are doing and also the issues that you've brought to our attention this morning and the conversation around what we can do about it. And, you know, I am concerned, as several of my colleagues have mentioned, that we're hearing consistently from you, we need more enforcement, we need more coordination, we need adequate resourcing, and we need adequate staffing to be able to do some of the things we're doing in a complex and challenging environment where the technology is moving faster than Congress, faster than our agencies. And what we're seeing at the same time is that those resources, both in terms of money and staff, are being cut from the administration as we speak. They are asking Congress to rescind additional funding. They're stopping funding. And so, you know, as several of my colleagues have noted, agencies like the FCC, the FTC, and the DOJ have actually utilized the law that we passed together, the work that we've done collaboratively to understand the problems and really conduct meaningful enforcement that has stopped scammers. And now it seems like the administration is taking the cops off the beat in this area and in many others. Mr. Winters, you noted in your testimony, and you mentioned just earlier this morning that the Trump administration has taken steps to dissolve the DOJ's Consumer Protection Bureau. And I believe you just said the Consumer Protection Branch of the DOJ. You just told us this morning that they had successfully prosecuted a case and stopped scammers who had, I guess it was against the data brokers who'd sold the data of 30 million Americans. And that data winds up in the hands of criminals who use it in these scams and others. So I think it's really important that we understand that these agencies need to be fully funded, and that shuttering something like the DOJ's Consumer Protection Branch, this expert-led enforcement agency, really puts our communities at more risk. It's not something we should be doing. You also mentioned in your testimony that the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the work that it has done in this area. And the administration is also shuttering or attempting to shutter that agency that Congress created, and that has been really critical to protecting consumers. And that's what we're talking about in this hearing, protecting consumers, protecting American citizens from these scams. I think that what we're hearing this morning also calls on all of us on this committee to redouble our efforts to do our work around creating comprehensive privacy laws that protect American consumers, because what I'm hearing from you and what we're seeing is that our data is being stolen, is being sold, is being used, and it's being used by these scammers. So can you take, with the time that we have, can you talk a little bit more about cutting the DOJ's Consumer Protection Branch as well as the CFPB and what that would mean, Mr. Winters, in terms of protecting American consumers in this larger context, if you want to talk too about just the effort to take away the staff and the funding for these agencies that are protecting consumers from robocalls and robotexts that we're all clearly worried about and clearly concerned we want to address. How is this going to help or hurt us in that effort?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for the question. I mean, very simply, taking resources away from these agencies, and in the case of the CFPB and this part of the DOJ, completely trying to stop all of their work is absolutely not going to help in the fight against these harms. On the DOJ consumer protection case that I mentioned, yeah, that is a data broker that sold a list of over 30 million elderly Americans directly to a scammer. It's not just that it ended up in the scammer's hands. Data brokers will sell to anyone at any time. And so what Congress needs to do for both scam reasons and lots of other reasons is pass comprehensive data privacy law with data minimization and a private right of action and a few other key things. Or at least if you want to be more focused, it should be focused on restricting the sale of consumer data. CFPB specifically, the shuttering that really cuts off a essential resource for people that are victims of scams, especially. They have had, counselors, people that answer the phone and take complaints and try to get things resolved for you. There's a bunch of great stories of people that had literally had their scams resolved. They got money back from their bank with the help of CFPB professionals. So they can do things on enforcement and work with financial actors where people are losing their money. But they also are just critical support, and they provide also tracking of those complaints and gets it to state AGs and those who can help.
Well, thank you, Mr. Winters. I've gone over my time. I do have more questions for the panel, so I will submit them for the record, and I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Mr. Tomko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Americans received over 52 billion robocalls in 2024, which is nearly 200 calls for every American adult. And Americans also have lost 25 billion annually to scams that begin as spam calls. Unfortunately, we know that scammers often target older Americans who are especially vulnerable victims to these scams. Older adults in particular lost 4.9 billion through all types of fraud last year alone. I know I listened to the exchange that you had with my colleague, Representative DeGette, but I want to delve into this with the senior perspective. Certain scams put even the most technical savvy at risk. Scams that in some cases mimic law enforcement, hospitals, or Medicare, or the voices of family members seeming to be in danger or in need of money. So, Mr. Winters, what specific tactics do scammers use to target seniors and other vulnerable groups?
Yeah, I mean, and thank you for the question. Scammers in general capitalize on uncertainty and fear. And especially for seniors, especially those who are on a fixed income, all sorts of concerns about an unpaid bill, a toll account that you don't quite have set up yet, Medicare, potential fraud and targeting, like they are going to be thinking that the senior citizens are good targets for it. This is exactly why we had the case where a data broker bought a large list of senior citizens and targeted them with scams, and that's a terrible thing. And so again, yeah, they try to capitalize on uncertainty and fear, and that's why you see lost bills, job opportunities, especially in this current climate where a lot of people are getting fired and the economic uncertainty is everywhere. The job opportunity scams are going to be, more people are going to fall for them because it's, you want a job, you need to pay your bills. So, I think that those are some of the ways in which they're targeting everyone, but, are hitting seniors most.
And what prevention strategies have been the most successful in that fight against illegal robocalls and texts?
Yeah, so, there have been really strong enforcement actions by the Federal Trade Commission of voiced over internet providers. So, I think the most appropriate and effective enforcement is going sort of upstream, especially when you are trying to get accountability for some of the actors that are providing the content or the delivery or the targets of some of these scams. One other really good case was the Writer case by the FTC last year, where they targeted using the means and instrumentalities concept. In this case, it was a tool that generated lots of fake reviews, and the FTC was cracking down on fake reviews. But you can use that same tool to generate sort of an endless list of scam texts, and that sort of is a force multiplier for scammers. And again, the use of these AI tools makes it harder because there's no typos. It comes in perfect English, and there's no these weird links that we've all sort of come accustomed to. So that makes it even tougher.
Thank you. And Ms. Leggin, how is the wireless industry working to protect that older community and otherwise more vulnerable customers?
That's a priority for the wireless industry. And to do that, we work with AARP, and we support their National Elder Fraud Coordination Center, which works to take reports of victim losses in and then bring cases against bad actors. We also were happy to participate in the FTC's Stop Senior Scams working group, and we led the working group focused on text messaging issues, which was a cross-sector effort to explore ways that we could do more to protect older Americans from scams. We also participate in other working groups with consumers directly to try to push out our educational materials so that they know which texts not to click on, which calls not to answer, and we have those resources on our website and our members' websites as well.
Thank you. And the AARP that you mentioned has said that, I quote, "The alarmingly high levels of fraud against older adults underscores that stronger protections are urgently needed." So as technology evolves, so must our ability to combat these illegal and harmful calls and texts. Mr. Bercu, what additional tools does the industry Traceback group need to protect Americans from fraudulent calls or fraudulent texts?
Thank you for the question. So I mentioned in my opening testimony, I think there's ways to build on what's working and reinvest in our work. We are always adapting to the threat. A few years ago, we were only really tracing illegal robocalls. Now we're tracing threatening calls. We're tracing targeted scams, and I think that doubled last year how many we traced. So we're always adapting, and I think Congress's support on through targeted immunity, through extending the cycle, will allow us to continue to invest and innovate.
Well, I thank you very much, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Next up is the gentlelady from New York, Cosia Cortez, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Winters, I want folks back home to kind of understand why this problem is happening. The average American receives about 15 robocalls each month, but obviously, depending on who you are, you could be experiencing that in a day. Right. And we know that it wasn't always like this. So I want folks to understand what the root of this problem is so that they also understand what some of our solutions can be. Is it fair to say that essentially back in the day, calls used to be routed through phone wires, through your telecom company? And so your telecom provider, whether it was Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile, they were responsible for routing the calls, and therefore they were kind of able to trace who was making them. Is that right?
Yes.
And then as internet applications started to grow, then voice service providers and calls over digital services started to really expand in their infrastructure. And so it wasn't just your cell phone provider or even your landline provider that was in charge of your phone calls. It then became kind of these other kind of internet companies, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of intermediary service providers. Sometimes a call will go through like 8 or 10 of them before reaching you through AT&T or whatever.
Yeah, so it was really in that switch from call and telecom providers to the expanding growth of internet providers that really kind of allowed the volume of these calls to blossom, because we weren't just talking about telecom regulation, but internet regulation, right?
I think that's definitely a lot of the reason to blame for those additional intermediary providers that are harder to track through.
And so it's not it's no longer about who your personal provider is. As you said, you could have 10 of these companies routing this call. So you have the person who wants to make this robocall, and then it just leapfrogs between all these intermediary companies. Mr. Winters, how many of these intermediary companies currently exist? And does the government have any way to keep track of who these actors are?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, it is kind of an unanswerable question. I think probably since we've been there, there's probably additional companies that have popped up and registered on the robocall mitigation database. I think last time I checked a few days ago, it was over 9,500 of these intermediary service providers. And so, there is a list online. It's not a high barrier to entry. You have to, register that you are a company. You have to put a robocall mitigation plan in the form, but there's not a lot of vetting there, right?
And if these kind of abusive companies, sure, they have to register, but if we find that they're not complying, the consequence just seems to be that they get delisted from the database, correct?
Only sometimes, not even that sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But without any additional penalties, is there anything to stop these companies from just immediately getting relisted?
No, you can, if you are delisted, you can get another corporation and set it up and sign up again.
So if you're a bad actor in this space, someone that's, really perpetuating spam calls, in some cases fraudulent calls, you can be found to be breaking these rules. You can get delisted from the FCC, and then you could just turn around, and it's what, $100 to...
I think that's not even necessarily in force yet, but yeah, it'll be $100.
Yeah, it's $100, and maybe you'll have to pay it, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, there's an enforcement problem here, keeping these bad actors out of the space. In your opinion, as a consumer protection advocate, how can we, as Congress, work to strengthen some of these protections, and what do you think some of the best solutions here are?
Yeah, I think particularly to the lack of accountability in the robocall mitigation database, there's a few really easy things that either the FCC can do or Congress can instruct the FCC to do to speed that up, I guess. There is a really low barrier right now you have to have reasonable precautions of taking, to mitigate robocalls, and that standard should be increased to effective actual implementation. There should be requirements for the downstream providers, the bigger companies, to have responsibility for the calls that they're taking in from those 8 to 10 whatever plus intermediary service providers, and there is just insufficient tracking, insufficient consequences for repeat offenders even under the company they're doing. And one thing that we advocate for to try to increase that accountability, because it is genuinely a difficult problem to try to track all these service providers, even if there's a full court press. But one proposal we've put out there is to implement bonding for robocall mitigation database members, so that a third party is incentivized to make sure that they're actually doing what they say they're going to do and help protect consumers. So very happy to work with their office to try to make that happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Next up is Mr. Mullen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. Americans lose billions of dollars every year to phone-based scams. We must crack down on illegal robocalls and robotexts. With the recent enactment of laws that further empower enforcement agencies, there has been progress toward protecting people from these predatory practices, but not enough. I want to recognize former Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, who represents a district neighboring mine. She's represented that for over 30 years before her recent retirement. I want to thank her for her leadership on this issue. She introduced key legislation like the Hang Up Act and the Robocalls and Text Act, and I'm proud to help uplift some of that work that she led on in this committee and hopefully carry it forward in the future. As we've heard today, more must be done to keep up with the rapidly advancing technology and the increasingly sophisticated tactics that scammers are using. Enforcement agencies need the tools and resources to stay ahead. The more sophisticated the methods, the more likely people fall victim to them. As more companies integrate AI into their products, it's becoming even harder for consumers to distinguish legitimate communication from fraud. Mr. Bercu, you mentioned AI-generated messages are harder to detect and can present challenges for enforcement. How can the government and industry better coordinate to establish safeguards to limit harm to people from illegal calls using AI?
Thank you for the question. I think the fact that the criminal actors behind these calls use AI just underscores they will use every tool, every channel available to them to defraud Americans. And I think that's one of the challenges we have is they're already violating the law with impunity. They're committing fraud. That's violation of the criminal code. So that's one of the things we think is we do need a national strategy. We do need to prioritize criminal enforcement because they're going to continue to use the tools. And from the carrier perspective, there's not going to be a good way to know which tools they're using because, as Mr. Winters pointed out, they're so far upstream from where our members sit.
Thank you for that. We know that certain people in our communities are particularly vulnerable, like seniors and individuals with limited English proficiency. Mr. Winters, what can the FTC, in coordination with other agencies, do to be proactive in protecting vulnerable populations from these kinds of scams?
Thanks for the question. I think it is a lot of the same of working to cut off the problem at the source, right? So whether we're talking about an AI tool that makes it super easy to generate 1 million texts that threaten to be immigration enforcement or something, for example, the enforcement action should target those developers that are putting those products out there. Same thing goes for putting liability and responsibility for people throughout the call stream to make sure that the calls they're taking content from are actually doing what they're saying they're going to do. But I think that the FTC and all these, state attorneys general as well can be doing more to do better investigation of the members of the robocall mitigation database, making sure that the stir-shaken protocols are implemented, thoroughly and actually does what it's supposed to do. I think a lot of times we see scam calls that have the high level of attestation, despite that's being the whole point. So I think that there's just a lot more that they can do together.
And you also strongly assert, Mr. Winters, in your testimony that the FTC's overall enforcement capacity has been diminished by the recent unlawful firings of 2 Democratic commissioners and deep staff and budget cuts at the agency. So how are those agency cuts going to hinder FTC's ability to advance its efforts to combat illegal robocalls and robotexts?
It will hurt their ability to do so. As we've talked about, it's already a really difficult issue, even if you are trying your best and have all the resources you can. If you are taking people away, especially of an agency like the FTC that has a really broad jurisdiction, of course you're going to have less resources, less creative cases, just because more things are being put on less people, and the priorities aren't there either. And so, especially without the commissioners, the two of the 5 commissioners, you don't get dissent, you don't get the conversations that might generate more creative ideas or different ideas. And so between that and the staffing, it will just make it a lot harder.
Thank you for that. I yield back.
Thank you. Next up is a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the witnesses being here. I want to take a little bit different approach on this and just talk about a little bit of the impact that I'm not sure has been fully discussed today, and that is to physicians. And I'm in the process of getting screenshots of the physicians in my district, and one in particular who is showing me kind of the impact of about 20 a day that they're getting, that is really preventing these calls. These robocalls are preventing that physician from being able to take calls from the ER or from labor and delivery, and it's pretty concerning. Apparently, the apps that they're using to either diagnose or have conversations with their patients, the Abridge app is one of them, and then there's another app, and I'm not familiar with these, so I'm not the expert on this, but you can't use those apps when calls are coming in. And so I just wrote down from the screenshot the calls that recently came in. This was from last week on Friday: 231, 253, 257, 348, 353, 358, 359, 438, and 448. And in that period of time, starting at 2:30, ending at almost 5 p.m., there were a number of patients that were disrupted. So I know we're beating a dead horse with just how painful these things are. But that actually is pretty serious. When they can't take a call from the labor and delivery section saying, hey, we have an incident here that you need to get up pretty quick and, deliver. So I'll start with Ms. Leggin. And by the way, thank y'all. I know we're all working together to try to solve these, but, to what extent do you see TCPA and Traced being effective? And then I'll go a step further. We've had these discussions already in this hearing, but, the sense of urgency and what else needs to be done to prevent that physician and all the other physicians from having to deal with that in the middle of what could be an emergency situation.
Thank you for the question, and that it seems like a serious issue. Traced and the TCPA are great tools that are helpful in helping bring enforcement actions against bad actors under the TCPA if you're violating those consent, auto dialer, pre-recorded voice provisions. But unfortunately, bad actors don't care about the TCPA or other laws, so they're going to spam you no matter what. And that's where our work with law enforcement partnerships on the calling side through the ITG or on the texting side through the Secure Messaging Initiative to bring investigations against those bad actors so that we're stopping those at the source are really helpful.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, to support those efforts further, you've heard me say throughout this hearing, we would welcome help from Congress in prioritizing resources towards enforcement to bring more cases against those bad actors.
What do you think we can do, and anybody's open to answer this, what do you think we can do for hospitals in general, for those that are providing emergency services? Because nobody's using a pager anymore. It's all cell phone. Maybe they need to go back to that. But what can we do, to think creatively to really stop that for those? Every constituent of mine wants it stopped, but are there specific ideas?
That's a good question. It's a really challenging issue, especially when we want to make sure that critical public safety and public health services need to get their calls through. The same tools that we apply to protect consumers can protect, the personal lines of physicians and other things, call blocking, call labeling, call filtering services, and then combining that with enforcement so that we're stopping those at the source.
This particular physician goes through, deletes, and reports junk and reports it and does all that. So it sounds like it's been a continued issue. I'll go to Mr. Bercu. When we look at the gaps and just kind of building on this same theme, are there specific things that you would have us do to address those gaps? And if so, maybe describe how they affect, let's just go with the physician sector, the healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, by the way, we have the right framework. Mr. Winters was talking about the robocall mitigation database and couldn't agree more. We need to find ways to quickly find the bad actors in that database, get them out. The FCC does require that providers have to do due diligence about who they take traffic from. So we're developing the data to see who keeps taking traffic from these shell companies. So I'm optimistic we'll continue to make progress. There are, as Ms. Leggin mentioned, there are blocking and labeling in specific use cases. I know we work sometimes with some companies that sit on the inbound call side for a hospital, and we've had successful, and they have really sophisticated tools to see which is the consumer, which is not. So those are some of the things I'd recommend that the doctor looks into.
Thank you. Time's expired. Yield back.
Thank you. Next up is Mr. Allen for 5 minutes, please.
I want to thank Chairman Palmer for convening this hearing. And you probably heard this today from every district in the country. But my constituents frequently express their frustration with the persistent barrage of illegal robocalls, robotexts. And they're a nuisance and they're a significant distress, anxiety, particularly for our elderly population, because some of these folks are up to no good and are taking advantage of our constituents. These communications often exploit our most vulnerable individuals, and it's really eroding our trust in the telecommunications systems. I look forward to receiving updates on the progress made under existing laws and exploring actionable next steps to protect consumers and strengthen enforcement. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here with us. Mr. Bercu and Ms. Leggin, there has been a lot of public and private action in the fight against illegal robocalls, both under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act and under the Traced Act. Generally, robocall numbers have been on a downward trend over the years. If illegal robocalls trends have dropped, why am I still getting so many complaints from my constituents?
Yeah, and I think some of the members sort of expressed it. There are really positive numbers there, 50% reduction in scam robocalls, but not everyone's having the same experience. Some people do get more than others, so that is an ongoing challenge. But I think we have the right framework. I think we are tracing back those illegal calls. Some of those are illegal telemarketing. We're tracing them back. That information is making its way to enforcement. And in terms of the scam calls in particular, we know that they're going to keep going. Just because it gets a little harder doesn't mean they say, okay, we're going to go do some other line of business. They're just going to keep coming through a new channel, through a new method, through a new shell company. And so that's really where we think the answer has to be actually going after them with criminal enforcement, and we think that should be a priority.
Ms. Leggin, would you care to add to that?
I agree with what Mr. Bercu said. The framework that we have in place continues to show progress, and we continue to build upon that with new tools and enhance those tools with machine learning and AI and the latest technologies to make them even better. And I agree that more focus on enforcement by taking those bad actors off the field is where we need help. We saw a group of state attorneys general, for example, recently get a judgment against prolific robocaller Jonathan Spiller, so that prevents him from starting new businesses or otherwise kind of popping up again after getting an enforcement action against him. So things like that will continue to help make a big difference and continue to drive those robocall numbers down.
So we're identifying these bad actors. It's just a matter of prosecuting them?
Yeah, in many cases we are, or we're getting good data that can lead to further investigation. It's one of the reasons I'm actually optimistic about continuing to work across sectors, because we can now combine some of our data with some data that the banks can get that through, Ms. Leggin mentioned the AARP's National Elder Coordination Council, really aggregate data so that, because that's one of the challenges, if it's one scam, it's hard to get a prosecutor involved. But if you can show it's a multi-million-dollar scam, you can. So that's where some of the work needs to go.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Mr. Waguespack, in April 2025, SEC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. They proposed a two-year timeline for providers to continue to maintain non-IP infrastructure to either complete their IP transitions or fully implement one or more of the available non-IP caller ID authentication frameworks in their non-IP network. In your opinion, is the FCC's two-year timeline reasonable?
Well, I would yield to my colleagues to the right on more of the technical timeline there, because they're the ones that are going to be implementing some of that. I would say from our perspective, if I could just, since I got the mic for a second, bring in another universe of recipient of a lot of these robocalls that we haven't really addressed yet, is that what lies in between business and consumers a lot of times is small business. Because a lot of those recipients, they're kind of part consumer, part business owner. Their cell phone becomes their business phone, their residential phone,
Right.
et cetera. They can't qualify for do not call if it's considered business or not. That is a vulnerability that we hear from a lot from our members on small business, and it's also a vulnerability that's being exploited from some of these predatory lawsuits I mentioned earlier in my opening statement.
Right, yeah, you've answered my second question there about
Sorry.
the impact of, particularly in rural areas and other non-IP networks. Ms. Leggin, in your testimony, you discussed how CTIA and its wireless partners are embarking on the next generation of call identification solutions, namely branded calling. What is banded calling, and how will it help reduce scam and scam calls?
Thank you for the question. CTIA is building the next generation of branded calling by bringing together the wireless ecosystem players to give the consumer more information about who is calling and why. And branded calling, as the name suggests, means that the logo of the caller comes through. This framework provides verified identity of the caller and builds upon the Stir Shaken framework to make that information that comes through to the caller even clearer and better. So by doing so, we help empower the consumer to make better choices about, do you want to answer the call or not? And we think that'll be a really helpful tool in continuing to protect consumers from scam calls.
Good. Thank all of you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the Ranking Member Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a request for unanimous consent Representative Sorensen sent a letter to the chair and myself about the importance of taking action and his bipartisan Quiet Act, which addresses some of the issues raised here today. I ask for unanimous consent for his letter to be entered into the record.
We received it, the letter, and seeing no objection. Accepted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, the gentleman from the great state of Ohio, Mr. Ruley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. The question will be directed at Ms. Leggin. This is a bipartisan issue, and I think the most engaging, sensitive constituents what we have, I would say over 60. When I was young, I used to listen to a lot of talk radio in the 80s and the 90s, and it was a subject then, and it's just a subject as much right now today. They want to enjoy their peace and their tranquility, and these robocalls just keep ruining it. So what percentage of illegal robocalls and spam text messages originate abroad, and where do they primarily originate from? What part of the world?
Thank you for the question. It's a mix of robocalls and robotexts that come from both the U.S.
Ms. Leggin, your mic, please. Sorry.
Microphone. It's a mix. It comes from bad actors that are both located in the U.S. and outside the U.S. And we take seriously our work to protect consumers from illegal robocalls and robotexts that originate abroad. It continues to evolve, but Southeast Asia is one area, including India, and the call centers there that Mr. Bercu mentioned earlier continues to be a source of illegal and unwanted robocalls and robotexts. So we support efforts like those at the FCC, where they have memorandums of understanding with international partners, with states, to collaborate on enforcement against the bad actors located outside the U.S.
Out of curiosity, do you think that America has migrated into an evolution where we've gone better than we have in the early 90s, or not really?
We've definitely gotten a lot better than the early 90s, and especially over the last 10 years. On the robocall front, we've had a lot of attention to this issue from this committee through the Traceback, from the FCC and other agencies giving us more tools, more authority to go after bad actors in this space. And there's been a lot of innovation in the texting space as well over the years to make our onboarding, our filtering, our blocking and consumer reporting tools even better, and we continue to enhance those every day.
Thank you so much. And then I have a question for Mr. Bercu. To fight against robocalls and spam texts, the FCC has formed international alliances and partnerships with countries like Australia, Brazil, Canada, the EU, Romania, Singapore, just to name a few. How should we move forward with helping the FCC handle enforcement with countries that are bad players, like in Laos and in Cambodia, who seem not wanting to get involved in the government? How can we get more involved with these countries that are allowing these illegal procedures to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And
Is your mic on?
Oh, sorry. That's a great question. So I think one of the things we'd love to see is that's why we do need a national strategy, because the same people attacking us here are also attacking consumers in Canada and UK and Thailand. I think as we go around the world, there's more of a coalition of the willing to go after the criminal actors here. And so, the FCC has those MOUs with other countries, but we also need it coming from the criminal law enforcement authorities at that level and working together to take down some of these entities. And organized crime really is what we're going after with those.
Do you think it's obtainable?
I think it's obtainable. I think we've seen some other countries take very aggressive actions. For example, Myanmar is now building out, there's reporting about these fraud centers in Myanmar. The Thai government shut off the power, so they are going to generators, but I think there's room to continue to build on those and build those collaborations because, again, those same entities are attacking us all over the world.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. And with that, I yield my time back to the chair.
Thank you. Next up is the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Leggin, I'm coming to you. And I had to be at another hearing for a long time. I apologize if this is redundant. In many cases, robocalls are so believable that millions of Americans fall prey to the various scams every year. However, the recent rise in robotexts, as we call them, adds a new layer of complexity. What makes combating spam and scam texts, why is that more difficult than robocalls?
Thank you for the question. CTIA and our members throughout the messaging ecosystem take seriously our goal to protect consumers from illegal and unwanted robotexts. voice and text are different technologies, and they present different ways that bad actors target consumers. So we've got different problems with different solutions. So it's just a different ecosystem where we still bring blocking tools to bear in the texting space. For example, we blocked over 55 billion scam texts just last year. But that's just one piece of the.
Can I give you my cell phone and have you block some more?
Happy to help, yes. We continue to up those efforts and bring new tools to bear. And in messaging, we've got tools throughout the message flow, including upfront vetting and verification services that help identify whether legitimate businesses are who they say they are and helps deter bad actors from getting on the platform in the first place. We've got sophisticated algorithms, machine learning, AI, and fraud teams that look at ways to protect consumers from unwanted and illegal text messages in the middle. And then we've got consumer reporting on the back end so that you can delete and report junk, or you can forward your spam text to 7726. And the wireless industry takes those in to use to enhance our protection tools so that we're taking in that consumer feedback to make those tools even stronger.
Do you know, this is a little bit, this question may be a little bit to the left. Do you know, or how, are y'all able to determine how many texts a company sends out at any given time? Can you, they send out 1 million, 10 million. Can you verify, identify that, know that?
So companies use a variety of different platforms to send out their communications. So to us, that's not something that we look at. What we look at is trying to make sure that we're looking for suspicious patterns, indicators of spam or other illegal things, to target those to protect consumers from those. Otherwise, it's really a balance to protect consumers while also making sure that legitimate business communications go through. So like I said, we blocked 55 billion last year, but we also let, supported 2 trillion texts to go through. So it's always a balance.
Well, I think 1 trillion of those came to my cell phone. Mr. Bercu, I'm going to come to you. As you're probably aware, there are varying levels of jurisdiction oversight when dealing with either foreign or domestic entities. Now, I missed the first half of his question, so if this is redundant, did he ask you about this?
He may have, but I'm happy.
Well, what are some of the unique challenges regulators and law enforcement face when dealing with foreign originating robocalls? Is that what y'all just went through?
We went through an aspect of that, but I'm happy to talk about it. We've traced, in our tracebacks, we've traced calls.
And how they vary from domestic ones.
Yeah, so I think in our experience, both on what we've seen through our tracebacks, but also some public reporting, I think what we see is that illegal telemarketing, often that's homegrown, and there's entities, John Spiller, Ms. Leggin mentioned earlier, that might be more local. But we do see a lot of the fraud comes from abroad, especially the scaled fraud. So in terms of other countries, I think those same actors are attacking everyone around the world. I think there's a lot of work to be done collaboratively with other countries. We've traced those. We do trace those. We find those entities. We sometimes see entities log into our portal saying they're a U.S. company but log in from abroad. So I think we're building that data set, and it can arm criminal law enforcement to go after.
Okay, very quickly, our first responders, medical professionals, and other critical service providers often deal with individuals who are at their most vulnerable, making them a prime target for potential scams and attacks. So the question is going to be, but I've got one to ask real quick. How do we address spoofing related to hospitals, police, government agencies, and other public service enemies? And I want to hone in on this as a question for the two of y'all. We'll go back to you, Ms. Leggin. How about, have y'all ever encountered what's known as swatting?
Yes.
And how often, or would you put a percentage on that, and what do you do about it?
So we take swatting very seriously. That's where someone calls in a fake emergency and has, a police team go to your house. That's something where we're not really seeing that as much on wireless 911 calls as much as it's on other networks. But regardless, the same tools that protect consumers from illegal and unwanted robocalls, like call authentication, like stir shaken, call filtering, call blocking, and then tracing back calls after they've gone through to find the bad actor responsible are all things that we encourage to address swatting, as well as partnerships with law enforcement to go after that criminal activity as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Seeing no other members here, wishing to ask questions, I would like to thank our witnesses again for being here today. Without objection, that will be the order. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask that the witnesses submit their response within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.